I wonder if we could begin our discussion by dealing with the question of what is it that motivated you to become a superintendent? What was that driving force? Who wants to pick that one up? We are on tape. This is so you gotta,
Let's try that again.
cut. It's like a radio interview. You ask the question, and it's like, let's start again. What is it that motivated you to become a superintendent? What was this driving force? Cliff, why don't we start with you?
For me, it was a chance to have a much greater effect upon the lives of children than what I was able to do when I was a teacher and a principal. And I thought becoming a superintendent would allow a district to have something in place long after I leave. And I didn't feel as though that would have been the case if I remained at the principal level or just at the district superintendent level. And that drive has pushed me to a point where I think it was the right decision. I think people come into education for too many different reasons and really not focused on the needs of children. And the superintendent has to be the one who anchors that belief, and that's been my motivating force.
I guess mine, I came up as a special education teacher outside the system, residential treatment centers, and then went into alternative education outside the system. And so my entire teaching career and my initial administrative career was with kids who'd been marginalized by the system. And every time I tried to reintegrate them in the system, the leadership at some level would deny them access back into the system. And somewhat naively, perhaps, I just felt that, well, I could do a better job than they were doing in terms of the children that I was responsible for, who were primarily poor children and children of color. And it really wasn't until I was a principal, much like Cliff, that I realized that my impact was going to be on a prescribed number of youngsters rather than a system, trying to make a systems change that would accommodate children rather than having the children accommodate to the system.
I would say I recognize I'm a non-traditional superintendent because I didn't come out of an education arena. I started out more in the private sector. And I've always been interested in impacting public policy in order to change rules and regulations that would help people. Mm-hmm. And when I began to move in the superintendent's arena to begin to address issues, public policy was very interesting to me. And I felt that I could impact public policy in the large arena that will help youngsters to be successful, because I believe that a lot of the issues that we are faced with that are hindering us from being successful are driven by public policy. So I look at it from that standpoint that public policy is something that I was interested in, and that we could hook the two together, public policy, helping children to be successful. That was a sort of a driving force in my career path.
I think I was probably more connected to where you are, Cliff. Being a classroom teacher and then moving into a broader arena and a broader impact and having success in a sphere beyond the classroom. But the other piece that helped me was having the opportunity to work with really effective superintendents, both Jerome Harris and Bob Peterkin. And once having the feeling that you've acquired the skills, you now should have the opportunity to actually use them in a superintendency to impact a community and to enhance the lives of kids. So it was both having a greater impact, but having really good on-the-job experience about learning what the superintendency is and what the skills are that you need to be successful.
You had the opportunity to work with African American superintendents.
Yeah.
Well, I never did. I don't know
I never had an opportunity until I
I did.
got into the central office, but I did not have a mentor as a superintendent.
Right.
We looked at superintendents as being in a glass house. They were untouchable.
Nobody adopted you?
No one adopted me, and until I met Franklin Smith in Dayton, Ohio, and he sort of gave me the authority to do some of the things I want to do. Not necessarily mentoring me, but say, give it a shot.
Yeah, well, Jerome's strategy kind of backfired. He had a strategy of finding, and our district was a district that actually recruited young African Americans as teachers, and he's groomed a group of people. But his theory always was, you come to the district office, I indoctrinate you into my philosophy of education, you learn the District 13 way, then I give you a school to run. And so everybody other than me came to central office, got indoctrinated, and became principals.
Well, you know, for me, it's sitting here listening to you. My motivation for being a superintendent was really like, it was about change. It was about like, and I guess you all were looking at the change thing too, but not having come out of the system at all. It was like one of these deals where, you know, for a long time we've been fighting in this community around the issues of how you educate poor black children. And when Bob decided to resign, to me the best person to have been the superintendent was Dr. McGriff. But it became clear that for a variety of reasons, one, I think her being a black woman,
Right.
she wasn't going to get the votes that she needed. So then the issue was, well, who's going to become the superintendent, and where is this person going to come from? And since we had been struggling around these issues for such a long time, it was kind of the notion of, well, why don't you be the superintendent? But I have to honestly say now that I had very little idea of what being a superintendent meant. And I will admit to anyone that
We tried to
take
tell you.
right. No, but I mean, I'm serious about it. I mean, I think that I went in there thinking I knew a whole lot, and it didn't take me long to find out that I knew a lot less than I thought I did. But it was really the notion of how do you maintain this effort to really try to deal with our kids that I think Bob and Debbie had really established. And so if you even look at what I did, for example, it really was to continue what I think was the core of what that strategy was. So I came into it, you know, with a little bit less historical concern or historical look at, I'm going to do this and this and this and ultimately become a superintendent. That was nowhere in my frame of thinking.
No, but I think when we talk about impact, we're saying the same
Same
thing. It's that you have a commitment to kids, and if you're a teacher in a classroom of 30 kids, you have a certain arena of impact. And the more, and you have a different level of impact when you're the superintendent with 20,000 employees and 200,000 kids. You're really shaping the lives of many more people, but you're still in the occupation that means most to you.
The other thing that drove me was something that was quite quite personal, and I'm sure each one of us has a story to tell around this. I just remembered so vividly how the public education institution writes off people
Right.
just so cavalierly. I mean, they have renormed the environment where they can just say, you're not going to make it. And there's a prescription of almost death for certain populations of people who are in public schools in this country. And I can go back to my high school experience where teachers used to just stand up and say, you're going to Concord State Prison. I mean, and just said it without any fear that nothing would happen, something would happen. Because in those days, you never saw the principal coming around. At least I never saw the principal coming around observing the teaching. I mean, it was a whole nother ballgame. And for me, I just knew that the superintendent position was one, and the role in the superintendent was one in which you could literally save lives. I mean, you can actually count the numbers of kids that you could pull out of this pool of despair. And so it's quite personal in that regard. And it's partly about maintaining these beliefs, but putting in systems themselves that would sort of take over the district in terms of culture. So if you decide to leave, or someone decides that you should leave, there's something there that would act more than just a rescue, but really have some opportunity for kids to advance. And I say that, as you guys know, and Debbie knows for sure, that this country is not committed to public education. I mean, they can pass whatever they want to get prisons constructed, and they have actually done that with all kinds of support from people throughout this country, regardless of zip code. So we face a daunting challenge, but one that is still within our reach.
I resonate to something that you said, James. I remember the day I understood that education was a sorting mechanism. I was 13 years old, and we went into high school, and all my friends that I've been in class with were sent down to the shop.
Mm-hmm.
And two of us out of like 12 from my neighborhood, two African-American students,
Mm-hmm.
were allowed in the academic track. Now you take that to the superintendency.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was delightful to be in charge when we were in Cambridge and in Milwaukee of changing the definition for gifted and talented children.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I mean, you have that policy power
Mm-hmm.
to say, no, not going to be like that anymore, and here is a rigorous alternative,
Mm-hmm.
but we're going to implement it. Now, that's a far cry from letting things happen to children in the ways that I've seen them happen to children in this country. I would argue that if, in fact, this country were truly equitable across race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, I'm not sure I would have felt the need to be a superintendent or to be something else in education, stay a teacher, become a professor, do whatever. But the absolute horror of watching kids be consigned to lesser opportunities just really spurred something that said, no.
Yeah.
If I can find a way, however you do it, to the top, I'm gonna find my way there. And then you've got to do the public policy issues and the backup implementation issues, the monitoring issues, to say, this is going to be a new day in a way that you all may not have seen it. And you all know how tough that is.
Another inspiration for me was Ron Edmonds.
Mm-hmm.
He was in New York when I worked in New York and had a chance to work with him in the school improvement program. And Ron was very inspiring when he spoke. And I remembered once in a speech he said, you know, he'd found all of these effective schools, but he had never found an effective school district. And so to me it became the challenge. I'm going to run the first effective school district, and that if it's because I had, in working with the school effectiveness program, we had created effective schools. So if it's possible to create effective schools, it has to be possible to do the same thing at a district level for urban school kids.
Well, you know, I think this driving force about kids was central for me. I mean, because we have been fighting here really for 20 years, I mean, or at least 15 at that time, around the question of poor black children and how come they weren't learning. I mean, why is it that when you looked at the test scores and you looked at the achievement data and et cetera, why did there continue to be this gap between black kids and white kids? And having fought in administration that had covered that up, you know, for years, and even refused to acknowledge that it exists, because it would have been a blow to what they had built their careers on, that being the integration plan that had been developed in this town, ostensibly to deal with the Negro question, you know, in education, that we were going to deal with it through desegregation and the type of plan that they developed. And when we began to ask questions about, well, you know, now that we have this, what's happening to the black kids? We could never get the data. I mean, we had to literally go to court, wage an all-out battle to begin to disaggregate that data to understand it. And then when you ask questions, I never will forget it. The then superintendent When I said, well, how come you all never told us this? This man told me two things. He said, number one, black parents could not stand to know really how bad their children were doing. And number two, it would have given fodder to the racists who always believed that black children couldn't learn. And so that was used as like the rallying cry for why we could not give out this information. So when Bob came and Debbie came to talk to the leadership of the district and have them say, we believe that all these children can learn and we need to develop a strategy for how that can occur was a tremendous thing. And I know they were warned when they got here not to talk to me, but I remember when Bob and I sat down and had over at the Boulevard Inn, and we sat down and talked, and I was just trying to explain like why we had been fighting and tried to express my willingness to help in any way that I could to promote an agenda that would just simply say that all these kids could learn. So when they got ready to leave, I mean, there was a real fear in my mind that we had to be able to sustain that effort. I mean, that was a very difficult thing in this community.
But if we look at the motivating factors, say, in a larger arena, and coming out of the South, which I came out of the South, and getting back to your point, we were tracked, and if you fell below the 5th level, you were put over in a category, and then all of a sudden you see a lot of kids that were your classmates not in school. They'd shipped them out. And then we moved into the arena that we're in now, where we're still doing the same thing because we look at gifted and talented, we look at special education, we look at Chapter 1, and all of those programs and things that are happening are driven by public policy. And that was the piece that was really attractive to me, and that's a challenging piece because you're always fighting a battle to try to change policies or rules and regulations to help children. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have a mentor, but I did, but it wasn't a superintendent. And I had two. My father, who was a minister, was principle driven, and he instilled a lot of principles in us dealing with leadership. Then there was a guy by the name of Jim Gynes out of Washington, D.C. that was an associate superintendent there, who is still a mentor, but he wasn't mentoring me about preparation to be a superintendent, but he was mentoring me on issues and things that impacted the country, that impacted cities, that impacted children, and how to take positions on those issues. But it's interesting, those things that motivated us as I listened to all of us. I'm wondering what's motivating people now to because you're getting different types of superintendents now.
Right.
And that I think coming in not because of children, not because of the poorest and the neediest children, people that are having serious problems, but I think they're coming in for different reasons, and it's scary.
And I see, I'm sure Bob would know this more readily than I, but just from my window in Rochester, I see that there's a thinner pool of candidates coming up the line in preparation for the superintendency. I don't know what it is, nationally for various positions, but I'm having a difficult time finding capable and passionate principals. I mean, my pool is very thin, and we've taken a long view of trying to develop our own from students, and then truly looking at some non-traditional candidates to come in. But I wanted to add one other point as I've been listening about what motivated you to become a superintendent. And I guess it's something in between the legal remedies that we've all had some experience with, pushing districts to do things in a very prescriptive way because of what's been found as clear denial of opportunity, and us sort of over-relying upon the resilience of children. There's got to be something in between that a superintendent can do, besides being told, the district being told what to do, and knowing that there still will be resilience in in our kids, and it's something that we need to make happen, through leaders and teachers in the district. So it's not going to happen either by chance, or it's not going to happen in some way, because there's a court there, and there's an office of the court, office with the court saying, you're going to have to do it or else. And I think that's where the superintendent can really make big and sustained differences.
I wonder if we could extend the conversation, because in some ways we touched on it a little bit, but I think it would be useful if maybe each of us would talk more specifically about the career path that got us to the superintendency. I mean, it came up a little bit as we talked about the motivation, but I think it might be useful really to hone in on the specific steps that sort of got you to the superintendency.
Could you stop for 1 second? It's time to move to the next question, and you did it. And I was thinking, we want to get through all 5 of these, and maybe you'll just sense it too naturally. Sort of a time when we must move on to the next one,
Yeah.
cover them all as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, I'll do that,
All right.
but I was also sort of doing it on the basis of, they looked like it was time to.
Right,
you know,
okay.
Let me ask you a
to-
question.
So it's about 20 minutes on each one, if you want to get through them. You don't have to, but if you go over 20, you're going to have less time
Right.
on another one in this section.
Is
no.
it acceptable, see, we could segue right into.
No, but I'm saying, but I just was saying,
Is that,
mhm,
It's
was
beautiful.
perfect.
That's right.
Was
I was
perfect.
watching
So
how
we
I
want to
took
keep
notes.
that. And so if you could just, add in about 20 minutes, or when after you hear all the good answers out there, just somebody just go to the
Okay.
next part. Okay? That was great.
Were you gonna take that?
the career path?
My career path was a little unusual in that I started as a classroom teacher, and I worked in central office always on school reform programs. I was never on the district budget. I was always on discretionary, innovative program budgets, and I spent most of my career, 15 years of it, with the New York City Public Schools, working with Jerome Harris, as I said earlier. Luckily, we had a partnership with Boston. In Boston, there was Bob Peterkin in Boston, who was in charge of a school improvement program there, visited our district a lot, had a chance to see some of our work. And when he became superintendent in Cambridge, he was looking for a deputy for curriculum and instruction. And I got the position. And then when Bob came to Milwaukee, I came as his deputy. And when Bob decided to go to Harvard, I got the superintendency in Detroit. And so I was never a building principal. I was a building reading teacher when I left the classroom, and then went to central office. Jerome's strategy of going back to be a principal, I said, I'm going to be an assistant superintendent or a deputy superintendent somewhere next. And if the Cambridge opportunity had not come along, I may have ended up being a principal for a while. Mm-hmm. I also left the system before I went to Cambridge to run a citywide dropout prevention program with the Urban Coalition, which was an interesting non-public school experience, but working with public schools.
Well, I had a,
That's a career path for women, by the way.
But
That
I
is a career
think
path for women.
that you have to connect yourself with change and innovation, and the thing that helped me is that whatever change initiative Jerome wanted to initiate that nobody else wanted, I took.
Mhm.
When it was like improve the reading scores in the junior high school, nobody wanted to do that. Then it was do a school-wide reform for the junior high school. You want to be responsible for turning around the worst junior high school in the district? It is the best way, if you're successful, it is the best way to get attention. I mean, everybody else look at you like you're crazy, so you don't have the jealousy or animosity about, getting a plush job. Take the worst thing out there, the thing that no one wants, and make it something good.
Yeah, did you find that not being a principal and having lots of experience in the central office afforded you an easier transition than it might have been otherwise?
Now, what happened when I worked with the junior high school principals, I got a lot of, they liked me when I was a reading coordinator and their reading scores went up. But then when I became responsible for school-wide change, they really resented that one of them didn't have the position. And that's when we came up with Turn Around the Worst Junior High School. And while I wasn't the principal, I spent every day in that school. The principal was going to retire. I did the planning for the reform of the school. And it was turning around, which we renamed the Ronald Edmonds Learning Center. It was turning around that school that got me respect from the principal. So it was sort of like having a principalship. And I had principal certification for New York City. I just didn't hold the position. So I know what a principal does. So I don't think I just didn't hold the position. But I think you have to know how to run a school and how to organize a school and how to change a school and how to inspire teachers at a building level in order to be a good superintendent, because that's where the action is. I mean, the action is in the school and in the classrooms, and you need a good curriculum and staff development background to talk to your teachers. Because the success of kids depends on what they learn. And if you can't have that conversation with your teachers, you can't be inspiring. I don't think so as a superintendent.
And how did Dr. Fuller do
I
that?
was just sitting there, and Dr. Fuller iced me out. That explains why I couldn't do that. I didn't know how to go talk to anybody. I don't know.
You lasted longer than both of us here as
It
superintendents.
doesn't mean that you're an expert in you can't be an expert in every field, but you develop a sense of how to listen to teachers, how to listen to their needs, and how to translate resources to respond to what they say they need to be successful.
And that's one of the foremost criticisms superintendents get when they are in the job, that they have disconnected themselves from the schools. And I was just interested in your career path.
Yeah, but see, on the point that Debbie made, since my career path was so different, because what I was a community organizer, and immediately before the superintendent position, held a number of administrative positions like the director of the Department of Health and Human Services, had been a dean of general education at Milwaukee Area Technical College, had served in the governor's cabinet as the secretary of the Department of Employment Relations, which was really like the personnel management agency for the state. So I was responsible for negotiating with all the unions. I had all the personnel rules. I put the pay plan together. And prior to that, I had been associate director in the Education Opportunity Program at Marquette, where we dealt with kids who came out of MPS who ordinarily would not have been allowed into the college except for the support services that we provided. And so as I was listening to Debbie talking, I think one of the things that I realized, or tried to realize very early on, was what some of my limitations were. So I tried to surround myself with people who had the skills that I knew that I did not have. And
So did I.
you know what I'm saying? And then really tried to listen to them and to give them authority and power.
Right.
But I thought, as a superintendent, given the career path that I came from, that I tried to do what I thought I could do best, and that's to communicate a vision of what could we do for kids, and to make those connections to kids. But I think what was interesting about the career path that I came to it is that it did have some very definite pluses and minuses. There's no question about that. But I think one plus was that I wasn't married to the way that the system had been structured or had been formulated. And so I was probably more ready in some ways to say, well, let's do it very differently. But the downside to that there were things that I didn't recognize because I hadn't had the experience to see it and understand what was happening. But I was helped in a lot by Debbie, of course, and I remember one day I called Bob after I had put an open letter to my board in the newspaper. I don't know if Bob remember this, to ask Bob, do you think this is a good idea? And I think his question was, have you already done it? Why are you calling me now? It's a little late. But, I mean, that was sort of my career path.
But I think you need to also point out, Howard, that you have a background in education.
And your work is with children and
And
families.
your work was always with
So-
children and families in the positions you held. And your community organizing was around education and improving education. So that there was maybe a part of the understanding of the picture that someone deep inside a system doesn't have either.
Right.
And coming to the system with that information could also be
Right, I
very
mean,
powerful.
yeah, I mean, like even in the North Division struggle, like I served for 2 or 3 years, I can't remember, as the chair of the advisory committee. You know, so, you know, we had all the
To the schools,
negotiations,
to the
right, to the
schools.
school.
Mhm.
You know, so we had all the negotiations
Right.
with the system and, you know, and worked that whole summer with people who were developing curriculum. So I got a chance to understand how the curriculum supervisors, because they had all of those supervisors, and how they work to develop curriculum. We work with teachers. So I've often said that I do not think I could have gone to any other city and been a superintendent. I think to whatever extent, you know, I was able to do it. I think what happened in Milwaukee allowed me to do it. But I don't know that I could have gone to Boston at that point in my life and been a superintendent.
Do you think you could have become superintendent in Milwaukee if you had a traditional career path?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Or anyone?
No,
No.
you,
Right.
since you're from Milwaukee.
Right.
We were talking about that as we were coming in.
Right. I
No.
think it would have been very hard. Man.
Timing was
It would've been
right. I
very
mean,
hard.
because when Bob left, they were not prepared for us to leave. And there was this tension in the community of, they tolerated this East Coast group coming in, but they were not ready for another set of outsiders. And when they looked around Milwaukee, there was not a deep, it was not an individual inside the system who could have gotten the position, from my assessment. And the
Even though we-
loudest critic,
Even though I think we were developing people, they were
Mhm.
years away from
Right.
being able to step up. And if the succession plan had worked, there would have been carry through if they'd had the
Mhm.
nerve to appoint a black woman.
Mhm.
But since they didn't have that nerve, they were really stuck. And in fact, I would argue that Milwaukee was lucky that you were willing to do it.
Never heard that argument.
Well, think about it.
I mean-
Who else would have, I mean, you sustained some things that we started, you started some things that needed to be started and advanced an agenda. You know, I look at, as we looked at the newspaper this morning, you know, they're in the process of being dismantled. I'm trying to think of who would have come in and have thought about the children in the community that we spend a lot of time caring about. Who would have thought about those children?
Mhm.
I just don't see it on the horizon. It's not, you know, it's not there isn't anybody out there, but obviously when they looked, they didn't come up with
yeah,
anything.
when they looked at, I think when the board looked at the plan that they had for the system, and looked to see who in the community has most consistently voiced the same philosophical positions, and who would buy them the greatest public credibility.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that
I mean,
was-
they might have been
Powerful.
boxed into this,
Swallow hard and vote for
but,
Howard.
but I
That was a
think
lot to
they,
swallow.
You know,
and although the
Right.
legislature had to vote to allow him to take the position, what they were voting on is that he had not taught in K-12 education. I mean, the kids who are in Upward Bound are high school kids who come to Marquette. But they're at Marquette and he worked with
Right.
them, but he had not worked with them in the Milwaukee public school setting. So it wasn't, and I think the Milwaukee School Board liked the fact of they were gonna get recognition as having done something non-traditional.
Right.
mhm.
There was a win sort of for everybody, and they needed a way to keep the momentum going in the system, and he was well connected. So I think it all made sense.
Mhm.
And I think on another way, it worked out better that I didn't get it, because I think, and I don't know, you can speak to this, if you follow your predecessor, you are sometimes locked in to
Mhm.
the vision of people of you as that person's deputy. And they have a much harder time seeing you now as the superintendent. And I think it was much better for me to move to Detroit, where my image there always was the superintendent, not the deputy to Bob Peterson. So I think it was a good win for everybody.
That's a good point. You know, I never thought of it that way because it was tough moving in as the deputy in a system that you had spent 5 or 6 years. But I never thought of it the way you just mentioned it because I was perceived, I'm still perceived as a deputy because the deputy, based on management style, not necessarily based on position. And what I mean by that, the deputy is a filter to make sure everything's clean and write for the superintendent and deputy. In my position with Franklin Smith, I delivered bad news. And people and people always. Yeah, I always delivered the bad news. So when I became the superintendent, people still looked at me as the person who was delivering bad news. But it's very interesting. I think Howard is very lucky because I don't think very many individuals move up in their hometown
Right.
and move to key positions like a Howard Fuller and Willie Harrington down in Memphis. Because most of us are looked at in our hometowns as whatever we did as a little boy or a little young lady, and they always identify us with that. But I came up in a very unusual situation. Number one, I did not want to go into education because my family all were in education, and my goal was to be a certified public accountant, but didn't know how to go about getting into that arena when I came out of school with a degree in business administration and a minor in accounting. And my first jobs were outside of education until I was talked to the substitute teaching, and I went to substitute at Douglas Junior High School in Southeast Washington, predominantly African-American school, and all of the kids in there were poor. And I fell in love with those youngsters. We used to have lunch, and we would buy a pound of bologna and cheese and crackers and sit in our classroom and just eat because they didn't have any food. And I recognized that was my niche. So I moved into teaching and only taught for 2 years because this young lady, deceased now, Miss Laureen Brown, said, "You have a skill in working with children. Why don't you go into counseling?" So you had to get a master's. I thought to get a master's, you had to be extremely smart. And I went back to school, got a master's, and I became a guidance counselor. Started working with children, and as I grew in the profession, children, I was really focused, and especially the poorest and the neediest children. I'm a strong supporter of those that are struggling. And then I would watch the principals and observe them and the assistant principals, and I thought they were extremely smart. And I said, I could do that, and I wanted to be an assistant principal. So, and I was a strong union person. It's very interesting because I always reflect on my position now. And I think that portion helped me being connected in the union because I understand why they do what they do. I don't agree with it, but I understand why they do. Because they want everybody in the profession to depend on them. We're the savior. And we were trained to operate that way. Principal can't help you, but we can help you. So I think that strengthened my skills as a superintendent. But then I moved on and left the system and ran a juvenile detention center, which gave me a whole different viewpoint of working with youngsters, because we had some very smart young men and ladies in this detention center that had committed a crime. But they were very smart. And what I found they were looking for attention, love, attention, and direction. A lot of times we would find out that they would do things because they thought it was right, but it was against the law. They thought this was the right thing to do. No one ever told them that there's a different way to do what you did. But I stayed in that system, and then I met Floretta McKenzie, who was the superintendent of the D.C. school system at that time, and I was very successful in the detention center and got a lot of press. And she called me one day and said, "We would like for you to be a high school principal." And I had not been in the high school since the day I graduated from high school. And I didn't have any education background or anything of that sort. And at the time I was working on my doctorate. And they had 4 schools in Washington, D.C. And she said, "Select a school that you would like to be a principal." I said, "I want to go to your worst high school." At the time it was Cardozo High School in Washington. And they had just killed the assistant principal in the hallway a couple of years earlier. Someone robbed him. And I went there, and people told me I was crazy. They said, "You're a fool." Even Floretta questioned me going there. And I said, "Give me 30 days, you'll see a different school." And I just finished my doctorate. My research was centered around the effective school. Ron Edmonds, never met him. He died during that period while I was writing. But we talked on the telephone over 100 times because he was really assisting me by telephone and sending me all of his information. And I was sold on those 5 correlates. I was sold, and that gave me a vision, gave me, and I was able to go right into Cardozo because the school was in disarray and I focused on my research. And 3 years later, we were very successful, and helping those kids that people say can't learn. I mean, it was 13th and Clifton was the roughest section of Washington, D.C. Plus, it had an impact on the community. Businesses started moving in that community because that building changed. Then I never thought about the superintendency. I started applying for assistant superintendents, and there are some of my very good friends now that were superintendents that I applied to, sent applications to, and they never called me back. And I see them now at conferences and places. And
I'm asking you for a job.
and never called me back. And an interesting thing, I'm gonna back up. I applied for an assistant principalship in Washington, D.C. 27 times and was rejected every time.
Assistant superintendent?
Assistant principal.
Oh, okay.
I still have the letters. I was rejected. And I was rejected because I always, I talked about the public policy issues. I always talked about changing policy to help children to read and, things. And I go in the interview, and I remember I went in one interview and asked one question. And the person asked me, what would I do if a girl came back to school and had been on maternity leave and she squirted milk in the teacher's face? I said, what does it have to do with learning? I said, sometimes the best decision to make is not to make one. They said, interview is over. Oh. And the person that was interviewing me eventually became a superintendent in this country, and very interesting. But then Franklin Smith recruited me to Dayton, Ohio to be an assistant superintendent. And I was very excited about that because when he asked me to come, it was interesting. He wanted me to come to be his deputy. But the politics at Dayton did not want 2 African Americans in the 1 and 2 position. Did not want
into that.
No.
They did not want that to happen. So he called me back and said, I can't pull this thing off. Said, would you come as assistant superintendent? I said, yes. So I went. And within 2 years, the deputy, who was a Caucasian female, left. And I was the senior member on his staff because everybody else had left. And I moved into the deputy. So they had an African-American superintendent, African-American deputy. Then I started thinking about being a superintendent when I became the deputy. And I can recall Franklin said to me when he was talking about leaving Dayton, he said, James, if you don't stay here, no one will be here to fight for black and poor kids. He said, you got to change your attitude and move into the superintendents. He said, you can get the job here. And I had my opinion about boards, and it was based on his board, and because I felt that there were some things that just I couldn't deal with. But he said, you can learn. He said, remember, you need 4 votes to get anything done, and you need 4 votes to fire you. Always work to keep 4 votes on your side. So when he left, I became superintendent, and now I'm sort of the senior superintendent in the country as far as urban superintendents are concerned. But my goal was never to move into the academic education, public education arena. I wanted to go the business route. But that preparation, having a degree in business administration and accounting, those skills I'm very comfortable with using now. They're helpful. Being a part of the American Federation of Teachers, heavily in the union, is very helpful to me now. And one thing I did, since I didn't understand reading and teaching of all that, back in the 60s and 70s, they always had workshops, reading and math workshops, a lot of money then, so I always would go back and try to improve my skills. And I stayed in school all of my professional life, and I'm still going to school because I think the profession is moving to a different level now, where different skills are needed in order to be successful. But I think I've been blessed to have some of those skills that people are just beginning to recognize. They're just beginning to recognize, and I think I'm very fortunate being a non-traditional superintendent and being able to deal with the economics, the financial, the public policy issues, as well as the academic issues. And I think I was blessed to come up that route.
I think that one of the things I wanted to piggyback on was this notion of mobility and moving up locally. And I don't think anybody around the table except Howard did it locally. Being by local, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you stay in one place and you move up the ladder. And I think many people who aspire to the superintendency, if they're not willing to go where the opportunity is, it's not that you can't do it locally. I think you can stay in one place, but it's likely to take you longer. One of the reasons I left New York was because I worked only in District 13 in New York, and I could count the people who were older than me, that when the positions freed up, they're in line before me. And I'm saying, I'm just not going to wait till they retire too. I mean, I love working there. We had a great district. We were doing great things for kids. But I said, there have to be some other good districts and good superintendents out here in the country, and you have to start looking for them. But I know a number of aspiring superintendents don't want to leave a certain region or a certain state, and that really limits your opportunity.
There's another limitation, I think, and I was struck by it when the two of you were talking, and it's putting in extra work and risk-taking. I mean, if you're serious about having major responsibility, then you have to have a lot of experience in the things that go on in your district. Being on the committees, taking the tough school. Cliff took a tough middle school also in Boston. I mean, doing the dirty work, so one, that you get the experience, and two, that you get recognized as somebody who can handle difficult situations and risky behavior, perhaps within, I mean, some boundaries, but risky behavior on the part of young people gets you the sort of background. People say, yeah, James Williams he could do that. He could move up and be assistant superintendent because he took Cardozo and turned it around. I don't know whether mine's traditional or non-traditional in a sense. If you went and looked at my high school yearbook, my ambition was to be a well-paid teacher, which I did not recognize at 13 years old was an oxymoron.
He finished high school at 13?
No, yeah, right. I made my decision at 13. I published it at 17. So I went to train to be a teacher, a Spanish teacher. I'd never taught a day of Spanish in my life, except for student teaching. Went into special education because there was an opening, and these were kids who had been taken out of their home and put in a residential treatment. And at the time, they didn't have all these special education certifications. You have to simply have a credential. And so I took the position, got my master's in special education, and taught these young people. We were then supposed to transition these children after they calmed down. They were severely emotionally disturbed, and transition them back to school. They would do it near the residential treatment center, and then they could go back to their communities. Well, we were just dumping them back in the institutions that had sent them to us in the first place. And so I asked the director if I could become the person in charge of those transitions. And that was my first administrative move. So I became a half-time teacher and a half-time administrator. I then was afforded the opportunity by the Urban League to be the principal of the Street Academy in upstate New York, Albany. And if you remember, during the 60s, there were lots of these sort of alternative schools, and the Urban League had a string of street academies across the nation. And that was my first principalship in a school of about 200 kids, and the first time I actually had anybody that could be called a mentor. I was about 26 years old, and it's Larry Burwell, president of the local Urban League, who told me that my passion was not simply going to be enough to move kids. Because see, I'd go to the school board meetings and curse them out because they weren't giving me stuff for the kids, and Larry would just, shake his head because I still wasn't getting anything for kids because they were so angry at me. Kids weren't getting anything. So he taught me a little bit about subtlety. And then one day I just opened the New York Times. I mean, I could be an advertisement, and saw this principalship of English High School in Boston. And I applied and became the first black headmaster in the city, first high school principal in the city. Little did I know that it was the first year of school desegregation in Boston, so it was a little more harrowing. Cliff remembers those days, a little more harrowing than the normal principalship. But we spent a lot of time trying to make that school safe for kids. And we were the year before 100% African American, and then we went 50-50, black and white, and it was really, really a lot of turmoil. But what it got me was noticed enough to become an area superintendent. I worked with Cliff as an area superintendent. He was a principal in the area. My risk-taking venture was really then accepting the job of budget director for the new superintendent after about a year in the area superintendency, because the district could not support an African American as deputy superintendent, which is what I wanted, which is the job that I aspired to at the time. And I'm glad I did, because like James' conversation, I learned the financial skills, I learned the organizational skills, and that got me promoted to the deputy for management, where I learned personnel and transportation and maintenance and custodials and all those contracts for the non-certificated people. And then that cemented my knowledge that I could be a superintendent, because I had both sides of this street, but I was never going to be a superintendent in the Boston Public Schools. They saw me as Bob Peterkin, English high school principal, at best deputy superintendent. I applied, didn't make the finals, and I said to myself, it's time for you to look somewhere else. And luckily for me, there was an opening across the river in Cambridge. I applied, won the job, and was there for 4 years. Lucky enough to find Deborah to fill in the many, many holes in my curriculum background, and then moved on to Milwaukee. So it's kind of traditional, except I started outside the system, both the special education and the street academy. As I said earlier, was dealing with those kids who had been thrown out or marginalized by the school system. And I just really felt that there was a responsibility, you talked about this at one time, there was a responsibility to get inside and do what I'd been complaining about. I have to then pony up and go inside and try to fix.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous point there, because it's almost like when people talk about the difference between fighting the revolution and governing. You know, you can because when you got to govern, all of a sudden you got to look at all sides. You know, when you got a position out on the outside, that is the position. You don't have to worry about what this person's saying, that person's saying. And in some ways, it's a hell of a lot more difficult to govern.
And Nelson Mandela would agree with
Agree
all
with
this.
Right.
If there's an example of
Right.
on scale.
Right.
I guess I was a traditional candidate for the superintendency, coming up in all of the usual places, teacher, elementary principal, middle school principal, high school headmaster, district superintendent in a couple of different districts within Boston and the superintendency. But in many respects, I think of myself as being both non-traditional and traditional. And I'm not putting any qualifier on either, one's good or bad, but I had always a non-traditional attitude and perspective about what needed to be changed. And I never thought I lost that. I mean, I know Bob, when he was the superintendent of the district, and I was a middle school principal, and he was also deputy, he used to have to advise me about my attitude in terms of change. I was always in that, I guess, top tenths where we kept pushing and pushing. And you know, Bob had the central office perspective, and when you're at the school level, the whole world exists just at the school level. And if things didn't go right, you know, you always had this comfort of blaming downtown. And Bob used to work with me about, you know, my understanding what the forces were there and the relationship that we had to have with the central office and schools. So having come through all of that, I had a elementary principalship outside of Boston in the North Shore in Salem, Mass. And I had this non-traditional attitude that said, I know I'm better than, you know, the overwhelming majority of the sitting principals in Boston. But not having that chance, I went outside and then came back in and served a short stint in the central office before coming a middle school principal. I was in the Office of Career Education, and took this middle school, and Bob knows it very well. This was the classic Blackboard Jungle Middle School. The Diablos who were on the outside, they took care of the territory. It was a Hispanic gang on the outside, and they ran the neighborhood. I mean, they were in total control. And to a large extent, they ran the school in partnership with a group of teachers who called themselves the Rough Riders. This was Theodore Roosevelt Middle School. And they earned that reputation because they ran out and ran over principal after principal after principal. And they were a force. So did some things there, I thought, very much in a positive manner in looking at student achievement. And then I said to myself, I've done some time where I wanted to do some time. And I told Bud Spillane, I said, Bud, I want to be considered for a school of choice. And it was a different reaction I got, because it's all right for many African American educational leaders to do the do and to do it with diligence in the trenches. But when you want to go to the other side of the street, it poses a different kind of, I think, challenge to school districts, because it goes back to that belief about people and what you can do. And to some extent, I felt as though I was in Latin school again, you know, where this teacher told me I was going to go out to prison. Because the initial reaction was, oh. So it was Boston Technical, the Humphrey Center at the time, and it was Latin Academy. And those were considered, two of them were considered examination schools. And it posed a very interesting challenge to him. I ended up on my third choice, and that was operating a new career education complex, very big complex, and Bob had served as the overall director at one point, and I came in as headmaster. I always maintained that if I covered these bases, it would make it more difficult for school districts to deny me. It worked and it didn't work. Knowing the reality of a career path, it worked in some cases, in other cases it didn't work. And probably one of the more enlightening illustrations of how it didn't work was when I made application to Minneapolis in '93 and lost out to the proverbial firm, who they just...
We call it failed strategies now, right?
Exactly. And what it did, though, it set a course within the community to examine the fit between the preparation of a particular candidate and what the district needed at that time. People for 2 years afterwards, at least 2 years afterwards, were protesting all the way to the commissioner's office and the governor's office about my not being appointed in Minneapolis. So it did make it very difficult, because one of the messages that came out of that from folks within the community, he's done everything right. He's done everything right, yet he was not able to prevail in the situation, and it would not have occurred if the roles were reversed. And it was a very difficult argument for people to deny, and they kept pushing that envelope, and it was a lesson learned, I think, for that whole region up there, and perhaps throughout the country.
But don't you think sometimes, Cliff, that timing is almost as important as your qualification?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can be qualified, and if you're not talking, let me give you an example. When I went to Detroit, I don't think that the most qualified internal candidate would have gotten the job, because Art Jefferson had been superintendent for 15 years. There was this image that the board and the superintendent were, I guess, as many people would say it should be, were very closely meshed. And with a new board, there was this promise to the community that it's a new day, it's a new way of doing things. And there was a desire, I think, on the part of the board to have someone that was not connected in the community. It was still a desire to have the person connected to the board, because you're connected to the board because they hired you, but you don't have the long history in the community or the connections with all of the range of groups. And if a board sets out to find a superintendent in that vein, or if they decide, like in Charlotte, that they're going to bring the home boy back home, you can be as prepared as you want to be, but if you don't know something about the politics of that internal search and what that board is really looking for, I think that there are just some places you're going to apply to and you're not going to get. And you got to be real, no matter how good
As
you are.
hard as it is to take, you almost have to just write it off.
Mhm.
I mean, it was obvious to me, for instance, when the people from Minnesota came, that they wanted to be on the map. But that if they didn't go on the map, you were the candidate. But that if they wanted to be seen as being on the cutting edge of reform, they were going to do something radically different than what, I didn't know what it was at the time, because who would have known that they would have hired a firm to run their school system. So I tell students in my program, in the Urban Superintendents program, to just blow that one off. You know, don't do any examination about your preparation and did you go to church on Sunday and if you did all the right things, because that's their craziness, not your, you know. And it's happened to me, you know, for whatever reason. I lost in Montclair, for instance, because they wanted to have the first woman worse than they wanted to have the first black.
Right.
So, you know, it's, okay, I understand that. Let me move on and see if somebody else wants somebody.
Yeah, it did become then an opportunity for me, because lots of places began
Knock on your
call.
door.
But it also...
And a learning experience. I mean,
But didn't it build your confidence?
It added to it.
Added to it. I mean, because if you go in there and you do a really good job and you know that you were qualified, and you can accept the other political stuff that's going on that's saying you're not going to get it, I found those experiences to be very helpful and more positive than negative, because it just helped you know what you stood for, what you were really good at. And because going through a search does crystallize lots of things for you.
It also tells you don't want to work for those people.
Yeah.
But listen,
That too.
but listen to what everything we've said, and all of us, came out of a different arena. What actually would be the characteristics that we need to possess, or we need to tell people that they need in order to become a superintendent?
You know, one of the things, man, that I've found in all of my administrative positions, and I want to say straightforward, I had some difficult positions. Being in charge of human services was a difficult position. Nothing compares to being a superintendent. Nothing in all of my experiences was even close. But the one thing I learned in all of these things is that, number one, I think, you really do have to develop a way not to take everything personally. I mean, I mean, that's very hard, because, you know, you're being attacked personally. But it's not always personal, even though, and so you got to develop this really kind of thick skin. But I think it's built on your own sense of your own integrity. And that if you're not rooted in that, you know, then when these attacks come and et cetera and whatever else comes, I'm not sure, you know, you can survive it. But so I would say, James, one thing is just this ability to not take things personally, to develop a very thick skin about, you know, criticism. But you have to have a strong sense of your own integrity that I think is built upon your belief in kids.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's one thing I would throw out.
The reason that Deb and I worked so well together was that we had an unshakable belief in the educability of children. So there was nothing, you know how people try to separate you from your deputy or whatever, and there was nothing that I ever worried about in terms of what the agenda was going to be. And the other word that I thought of immediately was integrity. I mean, if you don't have integrity when you start, it's not something you gain, you know, through a series of fire. It's something you maintain through through the fire, and I think there are skills, we've talked about some of those skills today, curriculum, finance, the politics of school board and the like. I'm not denying any of those, and I certainly train my students to possess them. But first thing I look for is somebody who's put their career on the line for kids in some fashion, or taken the leadership, or taken the risk. I have students in my program, for instance, who've been fired from districts for Arlene Ackerman, the superintendent of Washington, D.C., was fired by University, what's that right outside of St. Louis? University City?
University City.
For putting herself on the line for black kids. She went out on a limb, thought the board was going to support her, the board went south on her, and then they turned around and fired her. Now she's the superintendent of Washington, D.C., you know, she's where a general could not be, and so that's what attracted me to her. I mean, she had a solid background as a principal, but she'd taken this risk, and she wasn't sorry about it, she put it on her application. But now this is somebody I want to, because they've got a belief in African-American children, and you can't buy them off, scare them off, run them off in any fashion whatsoever.
I think that's the most important quality, that you have to be committed and passionate about educating kids. And you have to be able to communicate that commitment and passion to the people that you work with. And you cannot and should not have a different message for different groups. That when people talk about who you stand for, they know that, you know, you're unshakable on these 4 or 5 principles.
Exactly.
And
Non-negotiables.
whether you agree with them or not, that's what she's going to say everywhere she goes. And that's what she's trying to inspire other colleagues to embrace. And if you don't have that, I don't see how you can be successful.
I've always maintained, particularly in the superintendency now, that you have to come to terms with those unshakable and immovable principles. While you can change your priorities, damn it, you really never change your principles. And it isn't a question of you shuffling either. And for you to work with your different groups, they need to know that this stuff ain't ever going to change. However, priorities you build around that, and programs you build around that, or policies or practices you build around that, you know, may indeed vary. And it helped me to come into public education from the university community as the director of Black Studies at Northeastern University, and because that's the non-traditional perspective that I carry all the way through these different career jumps.
What do you think characteristics?
Strongly integrity, principle driven, and those are areas that usually kill superintendents. All of the preparation, the academic preparation, if you don't have those qualities, you should not negotiate your principles. When I went into the superintendency, I thought everybody in the community and the board members wanted to work for children. I was totally disappointed, because I thought that, you know, because I'm out there pushing the children, you know, just pushing everything, child-centered, everything. We're focusing on the child, And I found I had teachers that didn't fit into that mode, had a couple board members that did not, and the so-called leaders did not. And I'm still being attacked because I stuck to my principles. 8 years later, I still will focus all of my decisions on children. And I tell people, if it's not good for children, the answer is no. And those principles, and I see a lot of those principles lacking in a lot of my peers. A lot of my peers.
But I think another thing is that you talked a lot about, and I think we all have, is I want to use the courage word. Because I think if you don't...
You got to have courage.
Yeah, I mean,
you got to have courage.
But you know, but you really do have to have
You have to have
courage. But
courage.
it's a courage that's rooted back into those principles and into that integrity.
You have to be born with that, I think. I don't think you can develop courage.
You don't think so?
I think you got to, you know, I think growing up in Berkeley, in Norfolk, Virginia, in the ghetto, and being exposed to the other side, and I'm coming out of a mother, father, nice home, but I want to be with the other group. And I think that was a great experience, the little gangs and the little groups and the leadership that was in there. To me,
You still have a posse now?
of superintendents.
But today you probably need another kind of posse over
But I
there.
think that courage, because, to make a decision at our level, and you're in a boardroom, and I can recall I was dealing with outsourcing, and I had the support to outsource some things in Dayton. And this boardroom was packed with African American ministers. Even my minister was there. And I was wondering why they were there. And they were there to fight this process.
We're there for jobs.
And to stand there
Right.
as a superintendent and read that resolution. And I knew I had 5 votes. And my heart was thumping inside, but I was so proud because I had 5 votes. And you had to look, that's courage. But I have seen superintendents negotiate those issues in order to.
See, the thing that got me over was it didn't matter what decision you made. I came to realize that every decision you made, there were people who would support it and people who were against it. And since you were going to have people against you anyway, you might as well make the decision that you believe in. And the one that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you feel that you did the right thing. Because if you go into it, I think the problem that a lot of people have is that they function in a, how many people can I keep happy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
And I don't think you can do the job either counting 4 votes. I mean, you're not going to waste a whole lot of time trying to put things out that you know you don't have the votes for, because that's a waste of the public's time at a meeting. But, and then some things on general principle you put out there because you say the community needs to know this, whether I have the votes for it or not.
It becomes an opportunity.
It
to
becomes an
galvanize.
opportunity for you to communicate. It may be also an opportunity to shorten
Educate.
your
Right.
contract, but it gives you an opportunity to communicate your position. But see, you got to decide what's more important to you.
I think the community.
Oh yeah, that's the principle driven.
There's a
Yeah.
process of
Yeah.
teaching. I mean, we're still teachers, so of teaching the community what's important in the education of children. I mean, I took a lot of heat here in Milwaukee for firing an African-American principal. I mean,
Yep.
the place was jammed every single week.
You know she's a millionaire. Though.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
You helped to find her.
Apparently I did.
You have a sister after all, she's a millionaire.
I'll tell you, it showed up on my credit rating. And the community just didn't get it.
No.
Just didn't get it. And the scores were abysmal, and the absentees were abysmal, and teacher turmoil, and kids were just being chewed up and spit out, and yet the community came out in defense of this principle. Now, I could have backed off. I mean, I don't see myself as some superhero, but I could have backed off. Okay, what do I care? I mean, if the community wants her, here, she's yours, and you and your kids suffer the consequences. That's not our responsibility. Is to take those stands when everybody else may not be willing to or understand what their support means in the miseducation of their children.
That's a very important point regarding the superintendency, the whole issue of the heart, leading with the heart, leading with courage. When I came into Rochester almost 3 years ago right now, advanced a proposition that all kids would be taking Regents. We would systematically eliminate the local diploma. People looked at me as if I had horns on my head, and I had some tail that would, continue to grow. They now know that Regents really is just the floor, and honors 2, AP, and IB are ceilings. In fact, we have just instituted several of our schools becoming international baccalaureate schools. And what it did beyond looking at those schools and the rollout that's going to take place over time for other schools to be part of that is the education in the community. People are not debating any longer whether or not, am I going to be able to do Regents, and it is a very, very high standard. They were accepting the competency tests, these low-level competency tests, as a passport for entry into opportunities that really didn't exist. So the role that we play in educating the community is a formidable one, and it's one that's going to occur all the time, and it's just really setting the stage for us to be much more anticipatory about, those issues. Which ones you stay the course and you get grounded in, and then you get other people to begin to become ambassadors for that. So it's just not one person.
Well, the thing that Bob mentioned, raised an interesting point for me on this courage question as an African-American superintendent, because on the one hand, like the community wants you to deal with white folks, the African-American community, but they have a different view about how you're supposed to deal with black folks. And I understand that. I mean, and that, on one level, that is right, because the feeling is that when you get in there, you're going to have a greater sensitivity to us than, quote, they did, which I think is a reasonable expectation. But on the other hand, the issue is, if you start with where my real sensitivity is going to be is into the needs of these kids, that's the fundamental sensitivity. If I got somebody black who is not doing the job, I got to deal with them. I mean, whatever their race is, I got to deal with them. And so I know, and I'm sure Debbie ran into it as a woman having to deal with, quote, black males, and then we run into it about, hey, man, you down in the brother just like they did. And I'm saying, yeah, but this brother, because at the same school, I had to deal with it, right? And he accused me of like a drive-by firing, because of the sort of the way that we had to do it. And I really do think it does take courage to stand up to our own community and say, we got to make some decisions here that, are difficult decisions, but if we truly believe that this is about kids, we got to make these decisions. And so I think that courage thing for us, I think it's true for any superintendent, but I think for us, it has some added dimensions to it in terms of what goes down when you're trying to perform these jobs.
And also not making any assumptions that you're going to naturally get, because the miseducation of the children is only magnified in the miseducation of the community about what you can expect and cannot expect from the schools. And so some of the political posturing that has worked in so many other arenas now comes flush in the school. And if you are naive enough to think that everything you do as a black superintendent is going to be supported by the black community, you're going to be the ex-black superintendent. You're still going to be black, but you're going to be the ex-superintendent of schools.
Right.
I was no dummy here. I spent the year before firing a white principal who was clearly incompetent. So I wanted to set the stage for the fact that this was going to be about kids. But, my mama didn't raise any fool. I'm going out first on what I know that I need to do to show people that we're serious, and now we're serious across the board.
What's interesting is, did any of y'all take courses that prepared you for what you ultimately had to deal with as a superintendent?
I think I took a few at Fordham. One, of course, in the politics of education. When you spend time looking at the great school wars in New York City, and you have a different perspective on change. I think we get too event-oriented and too in the presence, and we don't really know that a lot of the stuff we're talking about now, people have been talking about and going through cycles in this. And I think that course, or when you actually, if you're not a politician and you haven't done a lot of government stuff and you watch the struggle of actually getting legislation passed, it is a different perspective when you're a superintendent trying to get some additional resources or some educational initiative passed. So I think in terms of, these are not sort of I'm not going to talk about curriculum and instruction things, because I don't think in most of the administrative, once you get to administrative level courses, if you didn't get a reading background or you didn't have an instructional background before you go into administration, there were not curriculum and instructional leadership courses, but there were politics of education or the sociology of education. Because I grew up in Virginia and went to all segregated schools, and courses that had you look at the diversity of an urban community and who the people are and the histories of immigrants and their entry into America. It's very helpful to you when you work in a Cambridge where and you know you need to go out and learn something about the ethnic groups in that community and not look at them as a single collective body. And I don't remember the name of this course, but probably the most important thing that happened to me in my administrative courses, I had an instructor who had us write a scenario of where we wanted to be in 5 years and how we were going to get there. And that's when I really decided I'm going to put on paper I want to be a superintendent, and now I have to figure out how to make it happen. And it shaped all the research I did in the courses that followed. Because I did a lot of research on women in administration, how they get hired, what kind of school boards hire them, what the stats are, a lot of things about the whole search. So if I had to pick 3 courses that shaped my thinking in the long run, it would be the politics, the sociology, and then this 5-year planning scenario type thing that you should be doing periodically.
My coursework helped me, and I got to answer it, or address this question in a different way. I want to sort out those courses that we would agree that would prepare you for a certain portion of the superintendency, the policy stuff, and leadership stuff, then sort of a whole program. And I dare say that my undergraduate experience as a liberal arts major has prepared me as a person and has prepared me, therefore, to understand life and all of the different issues which come about because of how the school district sits in the context of the community, and the community sits in the context of other larger systems and cultures. So I think that's been a very good foundation for me. The value adds I had in my preparation program really had to do with the work I did at Boston University by almost having a double major and studying in the School of Management. So I studied with MBA and DBA candidates who were majoring in health policy and administration. And that just gave me a whole nother way to look at change and to look at institutions within the community. There were many people in there who desired and are now CEOs of various hospitals in the country. We continue to connect. So that helped me out. There were very few courses that prepared me for the public engagement side of the superintendency. Very few.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are very few that prepare teachers for the public engagement side of what they do, how to conduct a parent conference, how to, same thing with principals. But the chance I had to go to the balcony and step back and look at all of this, through the work I did on my dissertation, was probably the best for me, because it just allowed me to put all the stuff together, and my topic was the impact of decentralization on the instructional role of secondary school principals. And I still go back and use the thinking and the literature and update the literature because that's what's been very important. My master's program, I think this has really paid dividends for me because I studied as a reading specialist and taught reading in a K-8 school in Boston. And as I look back now, it has afforded me the opportunity to have thoughtful and engaging conversations with teachers and parents and administrators. My nickname is Chief Reading Buffalo. And the kids know it, the clergy knows it, the business community, because it allows me an opportunity to talk with people in a language that is very common and important to them. And I would say that's probably a preparation that has been more beneficial to the superintendency for me than a course here and a course here that would talk about policy and how to do finance and that kind of thing. I learned most of that through experience. And the work I did in terms of becoming a reading teacher, that it didn't give you instant credibility, but it did allow you, because when you go out and you work with folks and you do demonstrations, you know, it's a small village. And
Right.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. Having, if you have a strong instructional background, I did my master's in reading too, and you're talking to elementary school teachers, and reading is, reading accountability is a big thing in almost every school district, and you can talk about programs and know that it does give you a level of instructional, being perceived as an instructional leader. There was one other thing that you said too, because I didn't go back to my master's courses. I was just thinking, the piece about your dissertation.
Right.
Mine was really about implementing change and using the school effectiveness literature. And what I discovered was Ron Evans was not the first person to look for effective schools. They were found in Chicago by a researcher many decades before Ron Evans. And that's why I'm saying that historical perspective. Because the stuff that we're doing now, Kenneth Clark was writing about in '69. If you just search back far enough, you'll find that it's just recycling, and you have to look at the historical to get some sense of how to help shape and not make the same mistakes over again. And too many people approach educational change as we're the first people to think of this.
Right.
If you notice, every district has to say we're the first to do this. You're probably not. You just haven't done any history to find out who did it before you and what can you learn from their implementation.
I was somewhat flipped last night when we were discussing this issue, and when I woke up this morning, I realized that I had insulted at least 3 of the institutions that I graduated from. So I had to go back and think about the processes. As an undergraduate, I learned to speak Spanish, which has held me in good stead in every district that I've worked in since. My master's program in educational psychology and special education opened up a whole world of brain development and child development that I had not, there was an explosion of the research was happening around that time. I don't think much of the coursework, and I want to talk about our program later, but I don't think much of the coursework in the doctoral program did me much good. But the dissertation process, I did mine on learning environments, changing and adapting learning environments to the learning styles of children. The conversations with my cohort peers, who included Jerome Jones, Rudy Crew, Ulysses Bias, people who went on to be superintendents of schools. UMass Amherst at that time was kind of gathering up African Americans from around the nation, and having these conversations about the potential for black kids and black communities with black leadership was extremely powerful to continuing to advance my thought that I could do that. So that may have been more informal than coursework, but it was extremely important. And then it started me reading again. Debbie's absolutely right. Digging deep into the roots of your beliefs and why you believe what you believe, and keeping up on that sense has just been invaluable, because wherever I've worked, nobody can sell me the goods on something that's not proven, that doesn't have a base in either practice or research in a way that I have enough sophistication to look at this and say, no, this is not the agenda that we're trying to promote here, and I don't need to be about that, and my kids don't need to be about that.
There are 2 other things that I want to share that really helped me, and I can qualify it and quantify it, and that's the program I took through Cornell, the Labor Relations Institute. Invaluable, and the preparation for negotiations and collective bargaining and the like, invaluable. And the other one was deliberate as well, and it was within the program at Boston University. And this was really conversations I had with myself and then with my advisor. I took purposely 16 hours in research and probability, and took probability courses out of the math department, which is a different ballgame from doing it in an ed school and research design. So when folks are coming up, all the peddlers are coming up selling their wares in school district, it helps me work with and through staff to set the standards about, whether or not these are really efficacious programs or based on what and so on. But it's really made a difference because, again, the word travels very, very quickly that you're not going to come in here with snake oil and Ellen Gantry and all of these other folks that they're going to knock on your door and email you and the rest of that. They've got to come in with some stuff. And you don't have to waste your time with all these little dogs yapping at you because they don't even try it.
What are the existing kind of support entities that are out there now for superintendents that you all think would be important to discuss? Maybe we ought to begin with you on that question.
For preparation or support, or both?
For preparation.
Preparation,
Yeah.
okay. Because I think we try to do both. The Urban Superintendents Program at Harvard tried to learn the lessons essentially that we just came up with in the conversations here. I mean, there are a discrete body of skills and there is a body of knowledge I think that all of us need to possess. We do start with research and teaching and learning and bridging the gap between research and practice. That's the first keystone course that we take people through. And then we do we do law, we do policy and politics, we do microeconomics and finance because we think people need to understand fully, that conversation you just had, about the whole finance and equity issues and beyond the budgeting issues. You really do need to understand a great deal of that. Organizational development, we spend a lot of time on mentoring, mentoring folks. I teach a course, a professional seminar that tends to wrap the major issues in public education around the foundational skills that they're developing in coursework. And then the source of the main support for us are the superintendents, sitting superintendents, who agree to serve as full-time mentors for 6 months for our students. You know, as a deputy, James, you said this earlier, I thought I knew the superintendency cold. And when I was going to move into my superintendency, you know, I'd been in executive session and I'd been, Bud Spillane dumped everything he didn't want to do on me, just like he used to dump everything I didn't want to do on Deborah. I never had any time to study the superintendency because you're doing your job. And so we put our students out in a 6-month internship. Deb did one when she was in Detroit, very valuable. You know, her mentee is now a deputy superintendent in New York City. So that's the power of our program, is trying to match people up. You know, I'm going to be knocking on my colleague's door here, but finding people who can really sit down and talk to you about what it means to make the kinds of decisions you have to make, talk to you about the courage, the integrity issues that we raised earlier. The facet that we added to the program, and I know Superintendents Prepared, the program that Cliff went through, does the same thing. Is now we try to provide support once you graduate and you are in the superintendency. So for instance, in 2 weeks, I'm going to Washington, D.C. to work with Loretta McKenzie on a retreat for Arlene Ackerman, the new superintendent of schools, because that should be a function. If she came through the program, and I know she has a need, then we should be bringing those resources to the support of folks, especially people in this difficult situation. So we are on email to all of our students. They're all on a dedicated email system. We meet periodically. Superintendents come to us 3 times a year to discuss issues of importance. We bring mentor superintendents. We don't take anything for granted. Because you're a good superintendent doesn't mean you're going to be a good mentor. So we actually bring folks to Harvard, have 2 wonderful African-American professors, David Thomas and Stacy Blake, whose focus has been on mentoring within organizations, especially cross-race and cross-gender mentoring. And we put the superintendents through the paces of that, which we believe, and they tell us, also helps them develop people in their organizations other than our intern, you know, our one single intern in their districts. But you know, we're a small program. We take 10 people a year. What we're trying to do is to find really good people and give them the skills and the degree, because I believe to my heart that for the next 100 years, most African American superintendents are gonna need a doctorate. You know, I mean, you could say, well, what about, so, yeah, I know that.
Doctorate plus.
The fact of the matter is, that's just one thing out of the,
That gets you an interview,
right, that gets that out of the way.
maybe.
And then we don't make any bones about it, you know, we've replaced the old boy network. You know, Arlene Ackerman has hired 3 people from Urban Superintendent's program to be her assistant superintendent. Clarence in New York works for somebody who was in his cohort. She's the superintendent of the district in New York. There was nothing wrong with the old boys network, except there was only old boys in it, you know. Now we got some new boys and girls, yeah, networking partners.
Right.
And I want to look at it from a different perspective, because I didn't have the experience to go through as superintendent's prepared or Harvard or anything of that sort, but I have 6 people that have left my staff that are superintendents that I'm very proud of. And I was sitting here thinking, from an academic standpoint, there were no specific courses that I would like to identify that assisted me, but a degree in business gave me a different perspective on the whole structure. A degree in psychology gave me a different perspective to be able to sit and listen and analyze. And then the doctoral level really prepared me to understand research, information, in order to be able to make good decisions about children and the whole operation. And then I was sitting here thinking, and never thought about this until the superintendents that I have worked under. And my first superintendent was Hugh Scott. Although I wasn't, I was on the other side with AFT and then the union, I wasn't a fan of Hugh Scott. But now when I just completed reading his book that he wrote in the 70s, it's things that exist today.
Right.
So I have an appreciation for that. And then following Hugh Scott was Barbara Sizemore. And Barbara Sizemore came in with Kenneth Clark talking about merit pay and pay for performance and all that. And we were on the other side fighting that. But now I have an appreciation for what she was saying
Barbara said, "Thank you very much."
because I understand that. And then along came Vince Reed, who had a different style. He was a collaborator, bringing pieces back together that people had perceived Barbara Sizemore had dismantled the system. And he was a collaborator. But I'm reflective now. I learned something from that aspect. Then Flo McKenzie came along, who was the master in doing it all, and management and keeping people happy and bringing the private sector into public education, first in D.C., dealing with that. And then Franklin Smith, you know, their qualities, giving me an opportunity to move in this arena and talking about being patient and getting back to Howard's situation, being tough-skinned. You know, and don't take this stuff personal on every issue that you lose or win. And the curriculum aspect, I learned probably more curriculum from Vera White, who was the principal of Jefferson Junior High School in Washington, D.C. I was her assistant principal. The lady was extremely smart in curriculum, so it was more from a practitioner standpoint. And I would like to see, as we look at preparing superintendents for the future, that these components are very significant. The historical piece, like Deborah mentioned, you know, we're not the first to do this stuff. This stuff's been going on for years. But how do we get them into the arena to do the research and understand what happened back there, and then transform that into the activities of working with young people?
And the one thing that James, I always say about this history piece, though, is that, well, I think history repeats itself. It never repeats itself under the same conditions. And so, you know, something that may not have worked at another period in history could potentially work now because of the conditions that exist now. But I totally agree with you. If you have no knowledge of it, you have no way to talk about how do you reshape it, what is similar, what is different. So that, I mean, like one of the great books that I've read that I would recommend for everyone is James Anderson's book, Education of Blacks in the South, from 1860 to 1930. I mean, what has been helpful to me, and I just met him out at ARA, but what's been helpful to me in terms of things that I believe in now, but is when you go back and realize the role that black people have played in making public education happen in America, you know, during that Reconstruction period, but then to understand what happened when the Missouri Compromise took place, you know, in 1877, and, you know, whites took back power and went in and took the resources from the black public schools and forced black people to have to develop alternatives. So it keeps telling me, you know, what happens if we as a people ever get into one strategy for, you know, how we proceed. Now, I only mention as an example of how a book, to me, can have a tremendous, and there's a number of books that have a tremendous impact on my thinking. So it wasn't so much the coursework as much as it is
Right.
these books, this ongoing study. My dissertation was on the discriminatory implementation of desegregation in Milwaukee, which helped me to understand what we had done, you know, to these kids. And then I also hooked into Ron Edmonds because,
Right.
you know, it was the effective education and all of that, right? I mean, and the correlates and how were these correlates used and not used in the process. So from my standpoint, it's not the coursework, it's the exposure like you talked about through your dissertation. And now as Bob talks about the support, it's the exposure to sitting superintendents, you know, so that you get this real link to real life experiences, which I think is critical.
But I think it's not just the superintendents, because once your eyes are open to the range of fields and knowledge that you have, you then start connecting yourselves to great politicians and great people in finance. You go beyond education because you know to have the expertise that you need to have lots of different connections, and you need to constantly be renewing your knowledge base and your skills. And if all of your conversations, let me give you another. When I was superintendent, one of the things that one of the companies did was to loan to the school district someone from their PR department, which was an invaluable resource. Because here is a person with expertise always in how do you communicate a message, who are you being clear to, not, and if I'm talking to a group of educators, we hear things the same way because we're filtering it through similar coursework, years of experience. No matter how unique we think we are, we're too much alike. But if I turn to this end and have a group of people with none of our experience and send the same message, I get totally different feedback. And so more and more I've learned that having your close educational friends are important, but having another group of friends who care about education but aren't as embedded in the lingo and the current way of thinking that we do when we're inside a system or working with systems helps to continuously stretch how you think.
You know, one thing I was going to raise too, like with Bob, I don't know if you've done this or thinking about it, but, you know, I've been thinking a lot about having prospective teachers, for example, not just do student teaching in a school, but to be placed in a community agency, for example, because if they need to understand more about what's happening to kids and families in total, maybe if they're in some of these other places for some period of time, they might get a different perspective. If we have prospective superintendents, you know, should we place them sometime with I'm just use a legislator or some, because so that they can begin to get that piece of that experience.
Because
as
you
well
have to
as
go
just
up and lobby
Right.
as a superintendent, and hopefully during their internship they get to
Right,
do
they
some
do
of
that.
that.
Right.
But
We're also forging an alliance with Ernie Cortez.
Oh, yeah, right,
Yeah,
right,
right, from
yeah.
industrial areas,
Right.
issue around this whole issue of community organizing. Because he's kind of moving community organizing closer to the schools, and I'm trying to move the schools closer to community organizing, so in a way there's a synergy that gets people empowered to run their schools. So I don't have to run them, you don't have to run them totally. So yeah, I do think that's important. No, I try not to keep them in the ivory tower of the superintendency either, because it's located inside communities. I think that's important.
One thing that could be a dangerous assumption that we could make, and that's about mentoring. You know, somebody going through these experiences, whether it's community organizing or working with the dean of the delegation and watching something go through both sides of the house. It's one thing, and having a conversation with a sitting superintendent is another thing. But mentoring, there are standards that
Right.
people need to understand, and everybody is not going to be an effective mentor, whether it's a teacher Whether it's a
Right.
principal, whether it's a superintendent, whether it's a member of the clergy, we make some assumptions about that, that could be
Right.
very dangerous, because
Right.
when someone has had that experience, working with the dean of a delegation, and they're not matched properly with the mentor, so the person isn't able to see what happened and step back and see what will be happening later on, it's a
No.
part of the preparation for superintendents that sometimes, other than programs like yours, Bob, people take very lightly and just think you can roll a basketball out and we can sit and have a
Right,
conversation.
yeah.
And that qualifies as, some form of mentoring.
That's why we try to be explicit on,
Right.
on working with the people to understand what mentoring
Mhm.
is all about. I did forget to say one thing, and I think we ought to talk about this just a little bit. We also dismiss people from our program. If we make a mistake, and I think there are people in the superintendency who should not be in the superintendency,
Mhm.
of whatever color they may be. If we make a mistake, we terminate it early. You're a nice person, I'm sure, but you don't have whatever goes into my concept of the conversation that we had here today, and you need to be something else. Or you certainly need to be something else without our imprimatur on it. You won't be a superintendent, go ahead. But you're not going to say that you went through a program that's trying to figure out a way to grapple with the real issues. And you want to go grapple with something else, that's fine. And I think part of the issue about courage is us to say, but some people who are not doing what they need to be doing in the superintendency, is to say, you need to step down, you don't need to be in this business, you need to go back to wherever you came from, because you're not serious about it. And I don't know that always happens, especially in colleges that are in educational administration preparation for money.
You're right.
If you're in the local state university, in a large educational administration program, which I think does a lot of disservice to people, we don't sort out in ways that we need to sort out who should be sitting in the superintendency of Dayton, sitting in the superintendency of Rochester. I think that's an important job for all of us in the profession, especially since, how many African-American superintendents? 160?
About 160, 150.
Is that including all those down in Mississippi?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
It was
Less
somewhere
than
between 1 and
2%.
1.5%.
Less than 2%.
As of 1993, I did a study in 1995 on it.
Bob, I want to ask the question. In the preparation program, do you have a setting where superintendents or potential superintendents can sit around and have an intellectual discussion, like we're having now, to talk about issues, policy issues or academic issues? And the reason I'm asking, what I find in education, teachers don't sit around, and the principals don't sit around. And I can recall when I first met Howard Fuller, and I hate to say this, 'cause I respect the man dearly because he's committed to what he's doing. After I visited him here in Milwaukee, when you're committed to something, I respect that, whether I agree with you or not. And we used to have serious debates in the council about charter schools. And 95% of the superintendents at the council didn't want to talk about it, including me, didn't want to talk about it, because we had taken a position on charter schools. And from that discussion, Howard and I became friends, because he opened my thought process up to research and look further, not necessarily listen to what he said, but to go further and look at the needs. And I see that missing in our profession. And have you all talked about that or thought about that in your program too?
You'd have to ask Debbie whether it's effective or not, but we do ask our superintendents, we have an advisory board of about 15 people, to come to Harvard once or twice a year and to talk frankly about the issues that are happening in their district. What's really wonderful is that they are candid with one another and with students about the real difficulties of running large school systems. What's discouraging is, as I think it was Ben Canada of Atlanta said once, this is the longest conversation I've had about, I don't know what the issue was, instruction or professional development, since I've been in the superintendency. This is a day. The longest sustained conversation, and it's not that he's a terrible person. Ben's a very fine superintendent, but in his day, he doesn't, I guess there are two things. In his day, he doesn't find that kind of time putting out all the fires. And two, there really aren't all that many places that he goes where they have that kind of conversation. It happens in the council, and it gets diverted by organizational business. It happens in NAPSI, where we spend a great deal of time, as you know, talking about organizational business in the superintendent's commission. So yeah, James, we try to provide it, but I don't know, at least from the reaction of the superintendents and my memory of the superintendents, whether there are a lot of places that you could go and have this kind of conversation and take a day and really hear out your colleagues. I will tell you that when I've done it, inevitably I walk away with something, when I was a superintendent, that I used. I don't mean just enrich my brain, but I came back and said, Dad, you know what James is doing in Dayton, get him on the phone, because I heard him talking about such and such, and it's really important. May not be a program, just may be something that you've thought of in a very unique way that we were thinking of. I think that's important for us.
Let me
Yeah,
follow
but-
up on one
but-
question.
I want to piggyback, because what Bob is saying too is important if you're talking about anything educational. But the point that you made before is that even though as superintendents, we claim to be teaching kids to be lifelong learners, and what I've discovered since I've left the system is that as educators, we close our minds to any educational initiative that we're opposed to. We don't even have the intellectual debate. And to have associations where you said that the group says we're just not going to talk about charter schools. Charter schools aren't going to go away because you don't talk about them. It seems if you're a professional organization or if you're a school of education, your job ought to be having the debate and the pros and cons about this initiative so that your students or the people enrolled in your program or the members of your association have an informed decision. I mean, that's what I say to people when I say, you don't have to agree with me, you don't have to like vouchers, you don't have to like choice, you don't have to like charters, but you have an obligation to your members to educate them. That's where I draw the
In
line.
the culture within.
Right, and if your culture says, because we object to
It's
it,
shut
it's
down.
not gonna be on our agenda, we don't talk to people who do it, I mean, you're miseducated.
But I'm going back to the preparation piece. That's what I'm heading, the preparation piece to begin to prepare the future superintendents to be, like you just said. For instance, you mentioned about putting out flyers. In my position now, the whole role of superintendent has changed. I'm not putting out flyers.
Right.
I hire people to put out flyers. Because the whole discussion now at the superintendent's level is not running the day-to-day operation of that school system.
Right.
It's totally changing. And the scary part, a lot of my peers are not recognizing that. A lot of them are not recognizing it's changing. Because they don't want to, I'm assuming, to give up the authority to that deputy we talked about to deal with the day-to-day operation of this operational person, these individuals there, and hold them accountable for those stated outcomes. And my question, I'm still, and I'm quite sure but with the many programs out there, do we recognize that that role is changing? And the intellectual aspect of this profession, to me, is growing where we are going to have to sit and talk about charter schools. We're going to have to sit and discuss vouchers. We're going to have to sit and discuss special education, because those are the political the political issues that are driving this country right now, that's being discussed in Washington and all in our state capitals, and we're sitting back.
Add
Yeah.
accountability to your
Yeah.
list.
Well,
That's number one on everybody's
yeah,
list. And if you
accountability.
don't have a sense of a superintendent of how you're gonna do that,
And you get to the point where you don't even understand
And
why
standards.
special
Yeah.
education
Right.
exists.
Yeah, but for me, I thought I heard you saying something more underneath this issue of the resistance that educators have to discuss
Right.
issues of polemical nature. We shouldn't be discussing them because we have to. We should be discussing them and free associating about them because we want to. I mean, it's almost as if we get locked in at our level as teachers have been locked in at their level with the phonics whole language debate. Folks shut down because they have put themselves in some form of a niche, and they become so insular that they don't even want to talk about it until the issue is forced upon them to talk about it. And if we're really talking about, education in the classic sense, we should be
Yeah.
talking about these things because they're gonna help us grow and think in ways. And if we're not doing that ourselves, how can we then suggest that kids are gonna do it?
I want to hold up every time somebody gives me that argument, just like the creation of the African American immersion schools here. I just want to hold up the statistics of where the children are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can't do what? I can't segregate the children because they're going, what's going to happen to them? What's already happening to them now?
Right.
You know, and so to have that, you can't, when we have conversation in class about vouchers, for instance, it's not whether you should have vouchers or not have vouchers. It's if you have vouchers, what would be an equitable voucher plan?
Yeah.
How would you implement that in your district if in fact it became a reality? Would you stop talking to all the schools that the kids went to, or would you try to find collaborative ways of supporting the kids who have reading needs or special needs or bilingual needs and the things that those schools can't do? I mean, that was the conversation that we had with my colleague and his friends on the voucher side. Here was, and I remember having this with Deborah, how are we going to get those services to the children? While the mayor wants to sue, that's fine, and if the board wants to sue, that's fine, but the bottom line for us has got to be the children are our children. I mean, they're still our kids, and we've got to figure out a way, and this school can't serve them fully and be non-discriminatory. So how are we going to get those services over there? How are we going to collaborate? How are we going to change the conversation so that I don't have to stop talking to Howard Fuller, who, by the way, is the director of human services for the entire county, in order to prove my point that intellectually I'm intellectually stymied on that point, and I have to keep a physical difference for the council's purity or the association's purity or somebody else's purity.
We'll have to close this section. We reached our time limit on this, but if there's some ideas that we didn't get to in this part, we can pick them up.
I believe we hit everything.
we did.
We hit everything on there.
Let's take this.
The only
show,
thing,
didn't you?
no.
Didn't you have a show at one time?
No,
The only thing we
I
didn't,
said-
you went to Superintendent's Prepare, right?
Right, yeah. we gotta
And you
get that in
probably
there.
need to
Okay.
insert something on that.
Yes, Lord.
I will not be able to face
Let's take a
Loretta,
good half
so
hour.
I'm